So it's good to be back, and we're just wrapping up the earlier session, calling for greater capital to be directed towards good activities that can help with the green transition. And now we do have the money women just with us. So we definitely have the very people in charge of making those capital decisions. So let me introduce you to them, and then we'll go straight into our discussion. So right next to me, we have Karin from Baardwijk, and I hope I haven't butchered the name, Chair and CEO of Robeco. And next up, we have Kristin Magnusson Bernard, CEO of AP-fonden, which is of course, which manages part of Sweden's pension funds. And right next we have Caroline Pez-Lefèvre, who is Chair, I believe I have the right job title, Chair, One Bank for Corporates at BNP Paribas.
That's correct.
Perfect. So welcome all. And I shall also note how wonderful it is to have a panel with just women. So I think it's something to be mentioned. Oh, there is an applause. Yes, well done. Yes. So well done, the organizers, for having put together a panel with just women. Right. So the importance of capital. Clearly, a lot of money is needed to transition and to make this not just a green but also a fair transition. It's $1 trillion effort, and whichever way you look at it, you can't escape from the enormity of it. There are lots of financial services initiatives, particularly perhaps they came out of COP26 2 years ago. That was the finance COP, right? And it was a Canadian who led that initiative, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, Makani. So lots of enthusiasm, and at that time the idea was that all these banks and financial services companies, part of G funds, were going to mobilize those $130 trillion worth of capital towards net zero and all of that. And in 2 years, things have changed, haven't they? So a lot of these organizations have left G funds and the related alliances, and there was skepticism around how much cooperation could be done. There were even threats in parts of the world. I'm thinking about the US, where such organizations and cooperation would have been seen as a sort of antitrust activity and all of that. So let's start with where you think we are in the global conversation about the role of financial services companies, investors, asset managers, and banks in all of this. So let's start with the asset manager. Let's start with you, Kristin. Karin, sorry. Karin, yep.
No, I think if you look back to listening to your opening statement, have we done enough? Are we progressing? Yes, we clearly are. Is it fast enough? Is it good enough? You can have question marks around it. I would definitely say the topic of sustainable investing is something that, for me, pops up literally in every client conversation. And most of the, I would say, financial institutions have already committed to their net zero roadmaps. What I do see is that less investors are really committing to shorter and mid-term goals to actually measure their progress towards the end of the net zero roadmaps. And that is clearly a signal that there's more work to be done. I think looking at the whole ecosystem, whether it's the asset manager or the asset owners, there's a lot that still needs to be done to work together hand in hand on the pathway towards a low carbon economy. I think the biggest struggle I see is that many parties struggle from the conversation, the ambition level, into concrete and tangible action. And I think this is exactly where we need to help and support each other to get the results.
Okay, so we're not seeing whether the efforts are leading anywhere, essentially. And there is a little bit of fatigue. I am picking up from all conversations I'm having, whether with financial services companies or anyone looking at sustainability. What's your view? I mean, you would be pushing, right? So you are very close to the investors, so you're the one actually asking all the questions, right? So you need to, put the money towards sustainable activities, sustainable assets.
Well, thanks very much indeed, and thanks for having me. I am very optimistic, and I'm going to say that up front. But because I think when we start out by looking at what's coming out of GFANZ, what's coming out of COP, we are looking in the wrong places. Because the actual transition happens when capital is put to use, where you, through good governance, active ownership, actually manage to transition a company or a activity. And I see enormous activity and commitment. But it's also a question of maturity, because let's face it, this is hard. Many of you who run companies, especially those who run very asset-heavy companies, you know that this is a massive undertaking. And what I see, and back to your point about the goals and targets, I think there's been a little bit of a wake-up call. I should never set a target that I cannot attain, or I don't know how to attain, and I need to set targets that remain within my fiduciary duty. And so I think it's maturity, but with maturity also comes humility, but the engagement is definitely there.
Okay, so there is greater engagement, and you say you're looking at the wrong places where we hope change will come. So I definitely want to talk a little bit more about that. But yeah, so obviously you what you do is bringing together, right, across BNP Paribas all the different activities that work with corporates. So you're getting also not only, presumably you not only have the point of view of the lender, but also the one of the corporate clients.
Yes,
and
sure.
surely they must be struggling.
Yes, and to come back, on what you were saying, I guess we can look at the glass full empty or half full or half empty, and I am optimistic as well, so I prefer to look at the glass half full. And I think that we are moving in the right direction. Is it fast enough? Probably not. But it is not a sprint. Actually, we need to manage a balance which is very complicated, which is, we know it will be a long journey, and we need to tackle with very urgent, challenging as well. So I think that in that respect, BNP Paribas has been and is a leader since 2017, when we decided to phase out the non-conventional hydrocarbon. We decided as well to have a step-by-step approach and to accelerate in 2023. And actually, today, within our energy financing, we are financing 60% of low-carbon activities and 40% of fossil. 10 years ago, it was 90% of fossil and 10% of low-carbon. So, it is really a journey. And for our corporates, it is the same as well. So because you have at the same time to transform your business, and it is costly, the investments are huge, the technology are evolving very quickly. And on the other side, you need to work on the energy efficiency as well. So what we are seeing currently in some regions is that corporates are more working on the energy efficiency, because they need a lot of investment, but they will need to get there as well. And we want to support them and to accompany them. And as we have a strong corporate client base and a strong institutional client base as well, we can do the bridge between the issuers on one side and, the investors on the other. And I think it is critical.
Yeah, okay. So there definitely has been progress, and you mentioned all the data related to BNP Paribas. Staying with the bank, obviously I should also mention that in spite of all of this, the bank still ended up being sued in France under the duty of vigilance law, because three NGOs are saying that actually the bank didn't really follow through with or didn't take into consideration sufficiently environmental impacts under that law that establishes responsibilities across supply chains. And of course, that's a law that is being mirrored at EU level with the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive that I know everyone is very much concerned about. So I guess this just fleshes out the challenges of really following through with those intentions and with those goals. So what's your reading of this particular situation? How challenging is it to deal with?
I mean, I think it is normal that we are looked at by societies and by our clients, by our employees. It is quite normal. Actually, we need to look at facts and figures. It is what matters. And again, we are, every day it is a day-to-day concern of each employee of the bank. It is part of our core values, and we are acting like such. And I think, really what matters is to see what we are doing on a day-to-day basis.
I'm actually quite sure that we will look at regulatory architecture in a whole different way if we actually do this. And let me take a different example from the banking world, being an ex-banker. So today, it's actually very hard for a bank to finance the transition in many ways. Because if you want to do project finance, which is what you need to do for many of the projects that actually don't have assets yet, it's very hard on the current capital regimes to make that profitable. The entire post-financial crisis regulatory architecture is built up. Do standardized mortgages, do standardized corporate loans. And that means that those corporates, the startups, or those who are actually really looking to transform their business models, if they cannot do that out of their own balance sheet, it's actually very hard, or through debt financing. So I think when we talk about regulatory architecture, let's also look for the gaps that actually, help the end outcome. And I think that's also our duty as investors, as bankers, but it's easier to say it as an investor in a bank than a banker, to make sure that we actually have the infrastructure in place.
So you're thinking about investing in new technology, in green technology that may be perceived as riskier? Is that what you...
Well, under the current capital rules, the risk weights you need to set means that is very hard to make profitable, compared to pumping up a mortgage to a household that should not borrow anymore. And I'm being a little bit provocative here, but that's also just to show, if we are serious about financing the transitions, all the players in the ecosystem need to have a chance to play their roles. And bankers are good at assessing risk. Let them do it.
Oh, right, okay. So you're calling for regulators to essentially create a level playing field. So, for example, the mortgage example, right? So if regulators say, from now on, you cannot really, issue a mortgage to a house that has a really low, or a building that has sort of a very low energy efficiency, then that changes the
Well, we should still do mortgages, and I think it's great that energy-efficient households get a lower rate. But we also need to think about how do we do lending to corporates, because that's the real gap I see.
Okay, all right. So perhaps we can stay with regulation and see how, so regulators can definitely drive a lot of this activity. And we started talking about a few, bits and bobs where they can get involved in, such as real estate, due diligence, SFDR, of course, in the EU, and I think it was mentioned earlier. As regulators, at least in this part of the world, doing a good job, do you think? How would you rate them?
I think so sometimes I get the question, so how do you review the current regulatory landscape? Is it a blessing or is it a burden? And I think, let's be honest, this to a certain extent is a burden. It costs you a lot of money, a lot of resources, a lot of time and effort needs to be spent on, first of all, figuring out how this regulation applies to you and then get it right in terms of implementing it. So clearly a burden from that end. But there's also a blessing side to this. I think if you see the struggle in other parts in the world outside of Europe, where there is the absence of a taxonomy, and investors are navigating, I think, their financial performance and their quest for financial performance with the same quest for making sure that they have their sustainability plans in place and the right roadmaps and contributing to their sustainability goals, that's very difficult. So I think what you see is that the regulation that is into play also allows for more and more data to be disclosed. And I think that data disclosure also helps for our clients, because the more educated they are, the better questions they can ask based on that data. And I think it also helps and distinguish, I think, between the various parties in the market today that use the label of sustainable investing very profoundly and deep into their investment management organization and processes, as opposed to some companies who also use it more from a marketing angle. And I think this is where regulation also helps to have a more mature and better informed conversation on the topic of sustainable investing.
Okay, so you mentioned the taxonomy. Is the taxonomy actually giving you clarity? Because of course that's highly, that's clarity.
I think clarity is something else, right? I mean, there's a whole lot of things that need to be explored. And I think also the fact that there's going to be an SFDR 2.0 in 28 or maybe even later, there's a lot to still navigate. But the fact that there is more and more focus on the regulatory side, the labeling of specific investment solutions in Article 8 or Article 9 products, where it's clear whether or not the financial performance is key, or the or achieving your sustainability goals prevails, that already opens up a very good discussion, I think, with all of the stakeholders in this ecosystem to understand, do we have the same definitions? Are we looking at the same data? And I think that is also what regulation triggers.
Yeah, thank you,
And just to pick up on your point there, the challenge I see with the taxonomy and some of the regulatory architecture is that it, by nature, fairly static. And the whole innovation, the innovative part of the transition is very hard to fit into that kind of framework. So it's very easy that you point to things that look green, sustainable, whatever you want to label them, socially cohesive today, but you miss the market forces that actually will find solutions over time if you price things correctly. And one of my favorite examples is concrete. And you might not be thinking about concrete all the time, but I run a large real estate company. And today, if I want to sell used concrete to someone else, I can't. And that means that concrete looks bad. But if we could just have a market for concrete, we would think about building materials completely differently. And for that, the prices need to be right. It needs to be expensive to build with a large CO2 print. And I don't see that sort of drive towards innovation in the current regulatory setup.
Yeah, all right, but that would equate to calling for a carbon price or a carbon tax, right? So that's what you want. That's going to change everything.
I'm an economist. That's what I want.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Caroline, is that what you want as well?
I think it will help definitely. And again, to come back on what Karin was saying when it comes to data, we need. Data is key. It's the name of the game in that field, and we need them for investors to be able to know, in which product assets they will invest and how to measure them over time. And on the other side, on the corporate side, they need as well to fix targets, ambitious targets that we will be able to measure. So that's the reason why we need to work with coalitions as well to agree on common frameworks and common targets that everybody can understand. We are not there yet. We made a lot of progress when it comes to sustainable linked bonds, sustainable linked loan, and now we know what we are talking about. But still, we need to continue to progress in that field, definitely.
I think if I can comment on that, one of the things, if you look into data and the topic of data, is also the absence of standard definition and standardization. So first of all, I mean, having the right data, having the right quality of data, being able to work with the data is one. But then, are we all looking at the same thing? I think one of the things that we have launched recently is, I mean, we are operating in the field of sustainable investing for over 25 years. So we've been able to look at a lot of data. And we felt, so why not share that data with the outside world? And this is called our Open Access Initiative, where we have some of our data sources around SDG company ratings, but also country sustainability ratings. We share that with the outside world, not commercially, but just to share the data, because I strongly believe the secret sauce of what you do is in the applied side of data, is not in sharing your data with the outside world. What we get back from that is if you listen to the parties that actually use that data, whether that's your clients, whether it's media, whether it's NGOs or academics, and they give you feedback and where your data set is different than the other data set, this enhances the data. And I think that enhanced data we can use in the conversation with our clients, in our investment management processes, into, I would say, very deep and profound customized sustainable solutions. And here I think we can all benefit from having a more standardized conversation around data. But I think if we have that, that's already one step closer to getting it right.
And I think it's probably a good way, Karin, as well, to avoid greenwashing. I think it's at the core of greenwashing. When you have data that you can share, that everybody can understand, it's a best way to fight that.
Yeah.
How concerned are you about greenwashing? Either because you are being greenwashed, as in maybe the companies that you work with tell you one thing and it's another, or because you potentially could be accused of being a greenwasher. How serious is this risk for you? And again, we go back to regulators. So regulators paying attention to greenwashing certainly has gathered everyone's minds on the issue, right? And thinking about a bank, for example, in other bankages we've seen in the UK, an ad was one of the ads was removed and prohibited by the advertising watchdog in the UK because it was accused of being misleading. The claims, green claims being made there were found to be potentially misleading. So regulators paying attention to what financial companies say is helping, right? Gather focusing attention. So how concerned are you about this risk?
Well, if I may start, I'd like to just stop for 1 second. Why would anyone engage in greenwashing? Because I don't think we talk enough about that. And the way I read it is that for a while, we made transition seem easier than it actually is. And for a while, it seemed that everybody else understood the transition. Everybody else had the data. You would be the one losing out unless you launched the ESG funds, etc. So I think there was an enormous stress in the financial sector to not be seen as not getting it, quote unquote. And I think also the conversation between the financial sector, between corporates and between politicians didn't happen because we would have needed to tell the politicians, look, what you're planning to do is great, but the data is not there. You cannot measure it this way. We'll get there, but we're not there yet. So don't push it. And I think that's why the initiative you mentioned is a really, really good one because it takes the issues, show it all is actually how serious this is, how much work that goes into doing this properly. And I think the more open we are about that, the easier it will be to avoid greenwashing for those who feel the pressure.
I think also the topic of greenwashing it feels to me as if the reputation of our industry is at risk to a certain extent, right? Here, the only thing that we can also do is not overpromise and underdeliver. And here, data plays an important role because how do you distinguish right from wrong? So I think this topic of greenwashing is everywhere, but it's also a good thing that we discuss it. I think it's very nicely tied into the topic of transition. So what do you invest in a green company becoming greener? Are we then solving this whole transition issue? I don't think so. But that's the lowest risk of having greenwashing, being held against you. But the transition and the impact of a transition is when you invest in polluting companies and when you try to transition them from being what I call a brown company into a green company, because that is when you move the needle. Although the perception of the outside world might be, hey, why are you investing in this company? But I think the reason for that, and I think there are many companies that also work with parties like Robeco in terms of their engagement strategies, is we can help them setting their roadmaps, setting those milestones, and actually step-by-step transition from the stage that they have today into their pathways, into their net zero roadmaps. And this is where you make a difference. But then the topic of greenwashing is out there because sometimes, and maybe it's a too bold statement, it's also in the eye of the beholder sometimes. You can be accused of this without actually having having performed anything that looks like greenwashing. But if the outside world is looking at it from that angle because they don't know how to look at transition financing, that's a big risk.
Do you have an example in mind to explain?
No, but I think, there are all kinds of, whether it's fossil fuels or other commodities, or maybe even your example that you mentioned. So sometimes you invest in a company because you know that they are on the right track. And this is where engagement plays a very important role. And for us, having those conversations is always better than excluding companies from a conversation. Because if you exclude them, what you do is you drive the status quo. Then the world is going nowhere. If you engage with them and if you force them into taking bold moves and steps and actually getting and driving result, I think this is where you make the difference.
But part of this transition will also be that some companies will fail in their journey. And we need to accept that, because somehow it almost sounded like if you don't reach your targets, if you don't make it, it's automatically greenwashing. No, it's a company that it's not reaching its targets. And it happens all the time. And when we put it in terms of ROE or something, none of us would think that's weird. So we just need to accept that transition is a very difficult company transformation. Not everybody will succeed, and that's completely normal.
Yes, and I think it is our role to support those corporates, to transform themselves. Because again, as you said, it's a huge investment. It takes time. And actually, what we did within BNP Paribas is that we created what is called a low carbon transition group made of 250 bankers, people across the world, to make sure that everybody can accompany internally and externally all our corporates to move into this transformation. And you're right, some corporates will fail, but we need to help them to get there. It is very important. It is our role.
So greater need for better data, greater data and better data.
Yeah.
The famous level playing field, all of that. Are these things that continue to be discussed and we're all nodding here among evangelicals, among people that actually are already convinced about the importance of sustainability? Or how is the conversation going outside of the world of people who are already very much convinced about its merits, because of ethical reasons, because of risk reasons, because of business reasons? How is that conversation going?
I think it's very important to acknowledge that every part of the world, every region, every continent, every company almost, and everyone in a different political environment has its own journey, has its own pace, has its own maturity. I think what is important to not judge them whether or not they are maybe not as far as we are in Europe or maybe specifically in the Nordics. It's about how do we help them in their own individual journey. So for us, it's important as an active asset manager, which building block in our sustainable investing proposition can we use and can we, I would say, use in that conversation with our global clients. For us, it's important, agnostic of where you are in the world, how your level of understanding is, where can we help you in that transitioning without being judgmental or without saying, well, that's not good enough. And I think that is something to absolutely realize. And it's not just sustainable investing is not just a conversation for the ones who already have said, this is important to me, or these are my top-down goals. It's equally relevant, I think, to invest time and money and effort into parties who are still in the midst of their search and their quest. And that's at least what I see in my conversation with clients across the globe.
Maybe to remind Karin exactly, we are global as well. We are operating in all regions, and the pace is not the same, obviously. And Europe is perceived as ahead compared to US and APAC. But when I am visiting our clients in other parts of the world, actually they are expecting from us, because we are the first European bank, because we are perceived as a leader, to help them, to transform themselves and leveraging on what we have seen with other corporates in Europe, for example.
But I think, just to comment on that shortly, so what is interesting, I just thought of that. I just came back from a trip to Asia, visited various clients and regulators, and also had a very good conversation in Singapore. If you see the work that's being done from a transition perspective with the local regulator, where they basically provide guidelines on how to do it. And of course, there are responsibilities for the asset owners, for the asset managers, for the whole ecosystem. But having a more pragmatic approach that drives results, I think that is something where Europe can actually take a look at how fast that is developing. So it's also unfair to say, well, in Europe we are way further. I think the conversation is matured, but I think the rest of the world is catching up and even maybe making it even more pragmatic than it is in Europe, and specifically in Singapore I had that experience.
So do you feel that then European regulators, so let's think about the taxonomy, went pragmatic enough and perhaps there was too much politics, would you say?
Well,
Politics.
many of the corporates I talk to and who invest in, they like, well, regulation. If I'm going to be frank, I'm just going to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's the conversation you don't, because coming back to your point about the evangelicals, I would say the ones you don't hear are the enthusiasts in the corporate space. Because once all the corporates understood, hey, this is about making materials better, it's about making energy effectiveness, it's about maybe constructing buildings entirely out of wood. Is it possible from an engineering viewpoint? The enthusiasm you hear, especially within industrials, heavy machinery, what have you, is palpable. And these are also the people who really have the know-how how to make it happen. So, but again, they won't be loud. They are engineers. They will go about solving things. But we should listen to them because that's the real difference I hear compared to 5 years ago.
I think the political part, just to come back to that, and it's interesting. I think, yes, politics do drive, I think, a part of this discussion, but it only determines the pacing. I don't think it determines the direction of travel. It will determine how long it will take for us to be united and having our commitment globally on these transition pathways and net zero roadmaps. I don't believe that politics will completely wipe out the topic of sustainable investing or change it. It can be that, of course, over time, you will see that certain regions will struggle more, but eventually, longer term, I mean, we have a very long-term horizon. As asset managers, our clients have a very long-term horizon. This topic is here to stay, whether or not there are politics, elections, or whatever.
Mm. So obviously, the mind goes straight to the States, right? Because, of course, we've all heard news about Republicans say that if Donald Trump is reelected, that there is going to be a mandate to repeal the Inflation Reduction Act, and therefore I guess that plays into what you were saying about the pace. But of course, being this a global problem, whether politicians are going to speed it up or slow it down in terms of solutions and facilitating the transition, the different, very different, as you were saying, Karin, very different realities across the world, and so Asia, you were saying they're ready, they're looking at getting ready, there is a pragmatic approach, but surely there is some catching up to do in terms of disclosures, in terms of availability of data. So what's the gap at the moment between how clear the picture may be in a jurisdiction like Europe, as opposed to how clear or less clear it may be in other parts of the world, and how problematic is this gap?
You want to go first?
I think, again, this is back to a similar topic about the absence of a taxonomy. I think that makes investors balance between, again, their quest for financial performance and sustainability goals, and it's very difficult. I think a global definition, a global taxonomy, unified data sets and clear guidelines on the global level will definitely help us. Clearly, that's not happening. Everyone's looking at Europe today, learn from our mistakes, and I think that's good. Everyone will be looking at what's SFDR 2.0 going to bring, and that's extremely important. At the same time, we can't just stop for regulation to kick in and wait for clarity. I think it's up to us, every party in this ecosystem, to figure out what the best way into this transition pathway would be. And taxonomies can help, definitely, but it's also up to us to figure out what the best way forward is.
So when I speak to my U.S. peers, the public pension funds in the U.S., they're not doing anything differently. If anything, the word that goes around, which I'm sure you all have heard, we're not greenwashing, but we might do a little bit of green hushing, which means that you do exactly the same thing, but you don't label it. It's just that it makes sense to make building energy efficient, to upgrade infrastructure, have smart grids in your city. I will not offend any of the Americans here, I hope, if I say that, there are some parts of U.S. infrastructure that could use a small upgrade. So the need is there, and the money is being put to the right places. The difference I see between Europe and the US, what could we learn from the US? Simplicity.
Yeah.
The beauty of the IRA is that it's very simple to apply for grants. The downside, I see two downsides with IRA. First is that it points to certain directions. Again, coming back to the innovation point, I don't think this is the way to create growth and productivity in the long run. And the second one is that it's very expensive. So the fiscal sustainability of this plan, and you already see some of the treasury auctions, etc., where the market starts protesting towards the bid, footing the bill for this, will put the dampener on how big the plan can get. But for us, we could certainly learn from the simplicity.
Okay. And it's a single market, let's say, in the US. And actually, I am meeting a number of corporates. All of them want to go to the US to benefit from it. It's clear. So, in Europe, we will need to find the way to finance as well this transformation. And we discussed it, you said it, Silvia, it's a huge investment. We will need all efforts because the banks, they will not be able to take everything on their balance sheet, as we know. So it will be a global effort. And I think it's a pity that, in that way, we don't have the capital market union. It has been on the table for the last, let's say, 20 years. And it is still at a standstill, in a way. And we are missing that. We are missing that. We are missing the securitization. And I think it would be a very important improvement in helping the investment for this transformation, really.
Okay, so what's your expectation for a more united or less united Europe, I guess, in the future, given political elections across countries, post-parliamentary elections in
we always get our act together in the end, but sometimes it takes a while.
It takes some time.
All right. Okay. So everyone wants to go to the States, but the EU has actually put together a package, right? So 250 billion euros. Are they not coming through yet? Or is it not enough? Is the pot not big enough?
Well, if you ask me as an economist, I think it's too big, because they will not be able to run a 7% budget deficit this way for very long. So the IRA is fiscally unsustainable. And unless if you just look at how much of the US budget will go towards servicing debt, and you need to cut entitlement spending, this is politically infeasible. So it cannot run for very long before it will need to be trimmed somehow.
Okay. So whether it's the IRA or the Green Industrial Deal in the EU, then the solution needs to come, you seem to be suggesting, from the private sector, from private capital. Okay, so Karin, you started saying we should not be looking at COP, we're looking at the wrong venues, the solutions are elsewhere. So where do we need to look at? And I'm assuming, are you going to COP? Or you're not going to COP for that reason, okay. Is any of you going to COP? Your team is, I know, yes. And
my team is definitely going, yes.
Yeah. And I'm assuming someone from BNP Paribas will also go to COP. Okay, so we should not be looking COP for these kind of solutions, for the financing solutions, or for climate solutions in general. Where should we be looking for sort of a global solution to this? Where do we get the global impetus for change?
Well, personally, I don't think this is different from any other issue that we face in the financial sector community. The difference here is that we have set ourselves a very ambitious goal and a necessary goal, because we have the planetary boundaries that gives us a certain time frame, and then we have the real economy that is really not ready to move along that pace, and that needs to be solved. But personally, I do not think it will be solved by making big pledges. It will be solved by action, and that includes the very hard trade-offs and discussions that now go on in many European capitals. And I can take an example from my own country. We've changed our view on nuclear power quite dramatically, because there was a collective, or maybe not collective, but at least a majority understanding that even though we have hydro, even we are blessed in many ways energy-wise, we would not be able to succeed in the transition unless we had stable base power. But that was, frankly, a much harder discussion than joining NATO, believe it or not. So some of these issues they are being discussed, but they're being discussed between voters, politicians, corporates, I would say closer to home.
So how did you get to that vote? Was the language different? Did the government have to change the language in which they were talking to convince the electorate, if that was the plan?
Are we talking NATO or nuclear?
No, nuclear. Well, we can talk NATO as well, but nuclear.
Well, nuclear, I guess we had more leeway in a sense, but I think it was rather. It would be interesting to ask the politician, how could you tell that the time had changed? Because we actually had a referendum on nuclear a long time ago, but collectively we were just there.
Where do you think you are in your countries collectively? Where do you think Europe is collectively?
Sorry?
Where do you think Europe is collectively in terms of the green transition? Do we need to change the language in which that we use to talk about climate change and the trade-offs that Karin mentioned?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, but maybe I think that we definitely need to accelerate. I think that it's a question of acting, as you said, and proof is in a pudding, as we say, and I think that it is what we need to continue to do, really to act when it comes to the COP. So hopefully we will be able to get with some progress, meaning that we should be able, hopefully, to triple the investment in renewable energy. So it will be about wind, solar, and nuclear is part of it as well, and we know it. It will be about as well working on the energy efficiency, I would say. It is important. And last but not least, we all know that, within this transformation, we need as well to work on a fair transition. Because we know that when it comes to northern countries, southern countries, and even in some countries themselves, we will need to move forward to a fair transition as well. And we have to take that into account in our thinking, in our reflections, I think.
Karin, did you want to add something about the language we use to talk about climate change and the fair transition as well?
No, I think we've touched upon today is the language that we use, the data that we look at. I think that the fact that we have continuous conversation on transition and sustainable investing is great. But how do we get to results? That is, I think, the way to take a look at this, and not only look at the regulator, but also look at ourselves. Every party in the ecosystem has the responsibility. I think it's the shared goal that we have to drive towards a low carbon world. And how to get there is, I think, by standard setting, consistency, and helping each other, educating each other. Back to our open access initiative, sharing data with the outside world. I think I would definitely ask other parties involved who are capable of doing that, do similar things. Share your know-how, share your IP with the community, and making sure that we talk about it, because together we can make that better. And that drives not just better data, it drives new insights, it drives better decision-making, and I think that eventually will lead to a better result. Is it fast enough? I don't know, but definitely this is the way to go.
Okay, so let's try to wrap up on a positive note. I feel like we tackled all the daunting and very important challenges, but let's try to finish on a positive note. So it would be great if you all could share an example of a solution, a technology, even a company, perhaps that you are working with, lend into investing in, that is potentially really going to make a big, significant change. And also the one thing that you think you would hope will come out of any of these big international discussions, COP or another discussion, perhaps even a private conversation with your peers, that is not only useful but also achievable. So let's start with the example of a good technology or a good product, a good financial solution that can really get us there and lift the mood. So Caroline, I'll start with you.
I would say maybe with a Nordic company, Northvolt, and we have been accompanying them in what they are putting in terms of EV battery, and I think it is critical, and it will change a number of things when it comes to energy transition.
I will then not mention Northvolt, even though it's a Swedish startup and we're invested in it too. I'm super enthusiastic about what goes on in the real estate sector, because 90% of the CO2 footprint of a building is before you construct it, before you even move into it. And the way everything from materials to circularity to energy effectiveness to the way you're actually using AI in real estate to build a lot smarter, a lot more resource effective, I think that's super encouraging to see. Okay. And it's good business too.
And it's good business, but is it confined within, are you talking about national examples, or are you saying?
Well, these are the companies we own directly. So we own the largest commercial real estate company in Sweden, and we see it in the residential dwellings as well. But especially commercial real estate is where you can make a huge difference.
Okay, all right.
So for me, it's not specifically one company that I would like to mention. I think it's mostly what is important is the level of engagement that you have with these companies. And before you know it, you call out one company or one sector and you applaud for the ones who are already doing it well. I think there should be equal applause for the companies who are full-fledged in transition and who are today in need of support and help, because those are the areas to definitely invest in from a transition thinking as well. And maybe to also to look at it from a technology perspective is one of the things that you mentioned. So we spoke today a lot about data and the quality of data and the insights. I think what's interesting to see is also how can we let technology and AI, machine learning, benefit us and help us in the insights of potentially detecting greenwashing or controversies earlier. And so large language models as an example that you can use as an area of investing in technology that leads to also new insights.
Okay, great. And because we still actually have some time, so before I ask you the last question about the one practical thing that you would like to see happen, maybe I could also ask you about. So we talked about the investments in good companies that come up with good green solutions and technologies. What about investments in fossil fuel companies that can actually also help in that, or should we simply exclude fossil fuel companies from the mix?
As far as BNP Paribas is concerned, we decided at the beginning of this year to accelerate the exit of the oil and gas and actually not to finance any new oil and gas exploration and production project. We decided as well to decrease significantly our part of financing in the sector, minus 80% when it comes to oil and minus 30% when it comes to gas, because according to the IEA, gas is as well part of the transition. And today we are number one in the leaders in a green bond emission. It was the case in 2022. It is the case in 2023. And we have less than 1% market share of the bond for oil and gas. So I think the travel of direction when it comes to BNP Paribas is super clear.
So what is useful in transition is to just pretty much close the taps.
Actually, we will continue to help, and fossil fuel has been, here for the last 200 years. So it will not disappear all of a sudden. And again, talking about fair transition, we need to be very cautious, but we will support the client which are going to a transformation of their business model towards the low carbon economies.
I think this is a sector where the divergence between companies will be extremely large in this transition, because you will have many who do not transform and they do not have a place in a Paris-aligned world. But there will also be companies who actually use their technological know-how to advance new solutions, and they will be very much part of the solution, and obviously you want to fund those. And it comes back to you cannot be too coarse in when you decide what's a fossil company these days. You really need to look, what are they doing? How are they transitioning? What are the revenue streams? Because it's probably the sector, I would say, where you have the widest performance outlook.
So a very careful ad hoc analysis for all of them.
Engage over exclusion.
Okay. Very simple. Obviously, you can only do it if you're an active manager and active.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's
so
also
everyone else.
Believe.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
All right. Excellent. Okay. So we are bang on time. So 3 minutes. So 1 minute each to tell me about one thing that you would like to come out in the next few months, very soon, that is also practical to achieve. So I guess perhaps you may not be allowed to say a global carbon price that is high enough. Perhaps that's not achievable, or maybe it is. Let's see. But then you will have to justify your comments. So Caroline, again, starting with you.
It's a very difficult question. I think that energy transition is not a punishment. I think it is a challenge that we all need. It's okay. No, it works. And again, are we fast enough? Probably not. Are we perfect? Probably not. But I think it's a question of doing things, acting, and walking the talk.
All right. So no one thing that you would like to, that you think can happen and is practical?
Like that,
Perhaps
don't know.
not quite. Okay, thank you.
Well, something I'm following with a lot of interest is the debate in Europe, especially around how to use fiscal policy in this area, because Germany, the largest economy, has a challenge with its debt rules and how it can finance forward-looking climate transition projects, and whether we can use public financing for those parts that are maybe hard for private investors to shoulder will be a major issue for Europe at large. I think that's an extremely interesting area to watch.
Yeah, but do you think that presumably decarbonization is going to be part of the election in Germany again, entering an election year? Do you think it's a conversation that actually can come to a resolution in a few months?
Well, I will not bore you with how the German constitution is set up, but it's actually in the constitution, so it's not so easy to change. But it is just, again, comes up, we have this large ambition, we have this overarching goal we want to achieve. We need to make sure that the architecture around it is conducive. So it will need to be resolved somehow.
Fiscal policy, and it's gelling with the climate policy. Okay, very important issue. Kristin?
Yeah. So maybe just a couple of words on COP28. And you asked what it needs to be, you need to achieve it, and needs to be doable. I don't know if this is going to be doable, and I don't know if this is going to be achievable, but it's a clear wish. I think for COP28, it was extremely important is the global stock taking on where are we in terms of our progress. If you look at Paris alignment and the Paris aligned agreements signed in 2015, we jointly said we aim to limit global warming to as a maximum of 2%, maybe even go to 1.5%. If you look at the latest United Nations reporting, we're heading for 2.4%, right? And given the political circumstances, macroeconomical situations that we're in, it's going to be very difficult to change that. But my wish is, then can we at least try to take out 10% and aim back for the 2.2% to make sure that we continue to drive policies, that we continue to drive this topic. So more of a wish than anything else.
Okay, so COP still an important venue, of course, but I want as a very, very final point, I will have to mention, of course, the investigation that was published in the BBC recently, alleging that the United Arab Emirates were using the COP28 presidency to potentially close oil deals. What does that mean, do you think, for the authority of this venue? Is it denting it, in your view? If the allegations are correct and all of that.
Well, that's the key point, right? So I don't think it's my place to comment on it, but there are a lot of parties looking into this COP28. I think if there is any place where we can strike a deal, it might be that place, but not for oil, but for the right things. And that's what my wish is.
Thank you. Wonderful. I guess that's the very final comment. Thank you again so much to having shared your thoughts on the role that the financial services sector can play in a green and just transition. And thank you, everyone, for having listened to us.